Welcome to Go Green Radio, everybody. So glad that you could be with us. Our guests today are from the Environmental Working Group, and we're going to be talking about a brand new piece of legislation coming out of California that would ban PFAS chemicals in pesticides by 2035. Now, I know that you guys have seen us cover PFAS many times in the past, and this is kind of a new bent. We've talked about PFAS in drinking water. We've talked about PFAS in other chemicals, cosmetics, children's products. But this is going into our food. These pesticides are going into our food. And so I am really pleased today to have a California Legislative Director, Susan Little, with us. Welcome to the show, Susan. We're so glad to have you on. Now, EWG, Environmental Working Group, has been working on PFAS initiatives for a while. But some of our listeners might not be familiar with what PFAS chemicals are. So give us an overview of what these chemicals are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jill, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to be on your show today. Um, just to dive right in, PFAS chemicals are a very large class of chemicals that have been around since the 50s, and they have grown in number and in use. These chemicals have certain properties. The most apparent property that they have is that they are very durable and they last a long time, which means they stick around in the environment for a very, very long time. And as it turns out, they stick around in us for a long time, or they can stick around in us as well. Um, and this is a concern because PFAS chemicals are known or we've been able to find, even though there's so many of these chemicals and they have to be studied individually one by one, we are finding that as they are studied, that they exhibit very serious health concerns, ranging from acute toxicity, like being linked to cancer and reproductive harm and tumors in people, but also other more insidious effects like immune suppression, um, obesity, higher cholesterol, and other harms that that are being found along the way. And so they are just chemicals that just don't do good for us in our bodies.
Mhm.
And again, they stick around for a very long time and build up in the environment due to
And
their
our bodies too, right? I mean,
bodies.
and that's particularly concerning to me because when you think about children being exposed to these, their little bodies are growing so fast. And, if these chemicals are building up while their bodies are growing and developing and maturing in all their systems, boy, that makes me uneasy to say the least. I want to welcome our next guest, Varun sorry, I did it. Here we go. Varun, you're going to have to correct me, but I'm going to try. Subramanianiam. Is that correct?
It's Subramaniam.
There you go. And Varun, as a science analyst for the Environmental Working Group, I mean, what a cool job for one. And I know that a lot of our young listeners and viewers are probably like, wow, how do I get a job like that? We'll ask you that question in a minute. But this bill that we're going to be discussing today is specifically focused on PFAS pesticides. What are PFAS pesticides?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having us. This is a big issue, one that we're spotlighting this year, but that's been on our radar recently. So really grateful to be talking about this with like-minded folks as well. So first things first, thanks for having us. And yeah, let's get into the crux of this. So PFAS pesticides are essentially active ingredients or the chemicals that kill pests like insect and mold. And so they're active ingredients that meet the internationally recognized and scientist endorsed definition of PFAS. And what that means essentially is that the chemical structure of these pesticides means that they're technically PFAS themselves too. So something about either they have a carbon fluorine bond that makes them a PFAS, they have a fully fluorinated carbon. It's the key to this is that it's a component of its chemical structure that matches that definition we have for PFAS.
Hmm. And why do we put PFAS chemicals in pesticides to begin with? I mean, like Varun, these are man-made chemicals, so we haven't always been using them. What do they do in pesticides?
Yeah, really, really important point. So, what makes them so popular in pesticides is that they're really resistant to breakdown. So, when they're stored in warehouses that are often in higher temperatures, when they're sort of being washed off and sprayed, these pesticides are able to remain on the produce items. And secondly, they're highly effective oftentimes at targeting the organism they're designed to target. So, it can improve the efficiency. Unfortunately, what makes them so popular is also what makes them so concerning from a human health standpoint. We know that the inability for them to break down completely means that it is essentially a permanent contamination issue, which I'm sure we'll touch on down the road. But that's really what makes them popular in pesticides and is why we're seeing them there as well.
Thanks, Varun. Yeah, that's very insightful. Susan, I want you to walk us through the provisions of this new bill, AB 1603. What would it do and when would it do it?
Sure. So AB 1603 creates a framework to phase out the use and sale and distribution of PFAS pesticides in California. It begins with a moratorium on the approval of, halting any new approvals of PFAS pesticides in California or allowing additional new uses. Secondly, by 2030, establishes a ban on any PFAS pesticide prohibited in the European Union. So there's a list of 23 PFAS pesticides that California still uses, but have been banned by the European Union. So 2030, we're getting rid of those. And then in 2035, a complete ban on all PFAS pesticides. And in the meantime, while this ban is going into effect and being phased in, the bill requires more transparency, public awareness, and notification that these pesticides are actually PFAS.
One of the things people always want to know about public policy, Susan, is, what is this going to cost? Do we have to create new government agencies and hire more people? What is this going to cost people? And, would this increase the price of our food and our produce? I mean, talk us through the so what of it all for the average California consumer, in order to achieve these goals of the bill of banning these pesticides. What do
Sure.
we have to do infrastructure wise to accomplish that?
This bill largely imposes it doesn't create a new program. It
Hmm.
just says this class of chemical pesticides can't be used.
Okay.
So it phases in this removal of these pesticides from our system. The one part where it requires government agencies to do something is it piggybacks on existing programs and just requires that through this there's a public notification program called Spray Days that allows residents to find out when pesticides are being sprayed around in their neighborhood or in their communities. And as part of that Spray Days program, this bill would be requiring that PFAS pesticides be called out through that notification. So people know, not only is bifenthrin being sprayed or being used in their community, but it's also a PFAS. And then
Got it.
lets the community know that this is actually being used around them.
Got it. Varun, back to you. Give us some idea of the scope of the use of PFAS chemicals in California. I mean, how big a problem is this?
Yeah, unfortunately, long story short, it's a huge issue. So we put out an analysis of US Department of Agriculture data, and what we found was that the most frequently detected pesticide and three of the top 10 most frequently detected pesticides on produce sold in the US are PFAS pesticides. So that's really that the most common pesticides we're finding are very frequently characterized by this carbon-fluorine bond that makes them so dangerous and concerning to human health. So all in all, it's a really big issue and one that's becoming increasingly concerning as more and more forever pesticides are being registered, are being invented. And quite honestly, we simply just don't have enough research at the moment to fully understand the risks of PFAS pesticide usage, whether that's persistence in the environment, toxicity to wildlife and humans, or bioaccumulation. So PFAS pesticides and their byproducts building up in our bodies and potentially exposing us for much longer windows than just when we're first eating that peach or plum or apple. And that's really a big issue and one that, quite frankly, is a blind spot for us and for regulation at the moment.
When you guys did your report on the scope of this issue, were there certain types of crops that you were finding more use than others? Give us some idea of, you know, where this was found, these PFAS chemicals.
Yeah, that's a really important thing to understand about these analyses is that not all produce items are the same. So one thing we found was that, for example, of peaches and plums, over 90% of samples had a PFAS pesticide known as fludeoxonil, which is a post-harvest fungicide that's applied to essentially prevent mold buildup. And these are showing up in 9 out of 10 peach and plum samples. So and we found that that trend holds true both for California grown produce as well as across the United States. So it's a really big issue, and that's not the whole story either. We know for California grown strawberries, for example, there are 10 different PFAS pesticides that are detected, meaning that it's really not just one pesticide being detected in high frequencies. There's a cocktail of different pesticides. Oftentimes, the sum of whom are larger than the parts, meaning that at when exposed individually, these pesticides are known to be toxic at certain concentrations, but when they're in mixtures and when they're interplaying with other pesticides, they're often able to trigger health harms at even lower concentrations. And that's not something our regulation reflects at the moment. So, long story short, it's a pretty big issue. It's showing up on a lot of different produce items, often in high detection frequencies and often in mixtures as well.
Wow. Very insightful, very concerning. Glad we have you guys on and glad you're at the forefront of this fight. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we have more with Susan and Varun, so don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio. So glad that you could all tune in. If you're just joining us, let me catch you up. Our guests today are from the Environmental Working Group, EWG. They are co-sponsoring a bill in California that would ban pesticides using PFAS chemicals by 2035. And that bill has just been introduced. It's Assembly Bill 1603 or AB 1603, as you'll hear it discussed in California circles. And we have EWG's legislative director here in California and one of their science analysts on to talk about the problem of PFAS pesticides we can do about it. So, Varun, I'm going to go back to you. I know we ended with you in the last segment, but I'm going to go back to you. I want you to talk to us specifically about PFAS pesticide use in California. Make us smart on this so that any listener in any part of the state of California knows what's up.
Yeah, great inroad as well. We know California grows the majority of the United States' produce, so what's grown in California often has a lot of domino effects on all the other states as well. So it's a natural place to start. That's where we started our analysis for that reason. And really, what we found was over 2.5 million pounds of PFAS pesticides are being applied to California farmland each year. And that was from a report that we put out at the end of last year that used state testing data to figure this out, and that's a staggering amount. The issue with that is that most of these forever pesticides or PFAS pesticides are known to break down into an ultra short chain form known as trifluoroacetic acid or TFA for short. And in a nutshell, that's TFA is really concerning for both environmental and human toxicity. It's one of the few PFAS chemicals that we've been able to detect in humans as well. And what we found was a 2018 study estimated that between 185,000 to 616,000 pounds of TFA could form just from PFAS pesticide use in California alone. And so, as we said initially, California is renowned for producing more than half of the nation's produce. And so these patterns are concerning not just for Californians, but for all Americans. Anyone that enjoys eating California grown produce, they don't have to be within state lines to be impacted by these practices.
Wow, that's really unsettling to say the least. Yeah, thank you for that, Varun. Now, Susan, I want you to put on a number of hats here when I ask you this question. Put on your, public policy hat, put on your, human health advocate hat, put on your human being hat, and tell us why a California bill to ban PFAS pesticides is significant for the entire nation.
That's a great question, and really it's very much on point with why we are co-sponsoring this legislation. First of all, what's interesting in California is that while when we looked at the amount of PFAS residue on crops grown in California, we found that even more of those crops contain PFAS residues. Almost 40% of the crops grown in California have PFAS residue. And as Varun said, we're supplying, these crops are going around the nation and are supplying more than half of the nation's produce. So it's ending up on everybody's dinner table. And so what's happening in California has this very direct consequence um, with what folks are actually eating, directly affect what people are actually eating and providing to their families all over the United States. So getting rid of PFAS pesticides in California would significantly reduce the exposure that Americans have to PFAS, specifically PFAS pesticides. And that is why we just think this is so critical to move forward and just phase out the use of this type of PFAS.
And Susan, to follow up on that, it sounds like, and I don't know what the numbers are for the total amount of PFAS pesticides being used in the US, but it sounds like there's a significant amount being used in California. And if that market goes away, let's say I'm just going to throw out a number. Let's just say even if we use 15% of the nation's supply of PFAS pesticides and we don't anymore, that takes a bite out of that market. And maybe it's not as profitable for pesticide producers to create PFAS pesticides if America's breadbasket, California, isn't using them anymore. Can you give us some sense of what it would do to the pesticide market if California just didn't participate in PFAS pesticides?
That is a great question and a very interesting point, Jill. I will say we have not done an economic analysis about what the effect of this bill would be on the pesticide industry, but we do know certainly that it would significantly reduce the amount of PFAS ending up on people's dinner plates and in
Yep.
lunch boxes. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, purely from a human health standpoint, there's no question. And I have to think back to 2012. I remember in 2012, California was under like a mega drought, and that's not hyperbole. It was the worst we had in maybe 1,000 years. And because we are America's breadbasket, there was a lot of cropland that just wasn't producing because of the lack of water. And there were restaurants on the East Coast, like little mom and pop restaurants, going out of business because they could not get the produce they needed to run their business because they bought so much from California and so did everybody else, and the supply was just gone during that drought. And so, it also impacts businesses across the country when California's ability to produce or the amount that we're producing is different. So that's really, really interesting. Varun, I'm going to go back to you. I want to drill down on the public health impacts of PFAS pesticides because whether you get PFAS exposure from your drinking water or carpet or whatever. I mean, it's not good for your body. Give us a rundown of what these chemicals can do to the human body.
Sure. And Jill, as you mentioned, we know a lot about PFAS already. We know specifically how PFAS works, but this is sort of an understudied source of exposure when it comes through pesticides. And quite frankly, we currently don't have a lot of research that specifically monitors how PFAS pesticides enter and accumulate within our bodies. So that is a major gap at the moment. But with that being said, we do know that several of these forever pesticides are increasingly being linked to major health issues. So that can sort of range from weakened immune responses, hormone disruption, reproductive toxicity, and that's just sort of naming a few. I know Susan touched on a few of those at the beginning as well. But a great example is for fludeoxonil, which is actually the most detected pesticide on both California grown produce and all produce in the United States. It's found on over 90% of peach and plum samples. So fludeoxonil was recently classified as an endocrine disrupting chemical by the European Food Safety Authority. Essentially, what that means is it interferes with a lot of the body's natural hormonal processes, and that can have a lot of knock-on effects for things like metabolism and just general health. And so fludeoxonil's regulatory status is currently being revised in light of these new findings in the European Union and by the European Food Safety Authority. So while we don't know a lot about these health impacts yet, what we do know is very concerning and most certainly warrants more scrutiny, more oversight, and definitely more regulation. We know that PFAS pesticides in general are long lasting. It's essentially a cycle of permanent contamination. We are able to demonstrate that that contamination is in our soil, in our groundwater, and as we are getting more data and as we're putting out more studies, we're also increasingly demonstrating that it can contaminate us as well.
Yep. Well, and if it means anything to folks out there, the CDC's website that describes PFAS impact on human health is still up in 2026, just in case you're watching this in another year, somewhere down the road. Wink, wink, it's still there. So, I think it's very important for us to embrace the fact that there are human health impacts to PFAS exposure, and putting it on your food and ingesting it, in what you eat, is logically connected to some kind of outcome. So thank you for that, Varun. And Susan, help us understand, because we're all learning a lot about how government works these days. Um, Tell us about the regulatory environment around PFAS pesticides. What's the role of the federal government? What's the role of the state government? Help us understand.
That's a good question, and I'm happy to explain that.
Mhm.
So the U.S. in the United States, the United States Environmental Protection Agency is responsible for evaluating and reviewing, and approving the use of pesticides and allowing them to go into the market and be used on crops and other places. In California, California also has a system to review and approve pesticides. And so in California, whereas in other states, some states have such a review system, in their state, and other ones don't, and the EPA is just their default regulator for pesticides. But in California, we have a department called the California Department of Pesticide Regulation that is also charged with evaluating and reviewing, approving pesticide use in California, and has to explicitly allow for the use of the pesticide, even though it's already been approved by the EPA. So in order for a pesticide to be used in California, it has to essentially go through this what we call dual registration process, where the EPA registers it, approves it, registers it as a pesticide for use, and then California does the same thing. Um, and as such, we have an age. So we have a fully staffed state agency with scientists and such that does this evaluation at the state level. Um, Unfortunately, what we found is that when it comes to PFAS, our state agency and the EPA don't necessarily evaluate pesticides from the um, from the perspective of for instance, immunotoxicity, um, long-term health impacts. For instance, they look more at acute health impacts. And so those are things that that's allowed this sort of PFAS pesticides sort of go get through the cracks and be approved. Also, what we've been noticing is that while the EPA is addressing PFAS broadly or trying to look at PFAS broadly, our state agency, Department of Pesticide Regulation, has not acknowledged that these pesticides are actually PFAS in chemical structure. And it's actually our analysis, Varun and my other colleagues' analysis, that has been calling out the fact that we're actually putting PFAS on our crops.
Mm.
And so this is kind of a new lens that we're putting in front of these agricultural uses of pesticides. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And once again, I am going to put in a plug for EWG, the Environmental Working Group. Love them. They're my heroes and sheroes because they are always on the front lines, leading the charge to help people make really good decisions based on science. And love you guys for that. We are going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we have much more on this new California bill to ban PFAS pesticides. So don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio, everybody. So glad that you could join us. We've got a very important topic today. We're talking about a new California bill that would ban PFAS pesticides in our agricultural use here in the state. It's AB 1603. If you want to follow this bill, it's pretty easy to Google California Assembly Bill 1603. You can also check out the Environmental Working Group's website because they've got all kinds of good stuff on there. It's ewg.org, and two of their representatives are here with us today. Varun, I want to go to you as a science analyst. We've talked about the human health impacts of PFAS and PFAS pesticides, but what are the environmental impacts of the use of these pesticides?
Yeah, so we know that just like any other PFAS chemical, PFAS pesticides are almost impossible to break down fully. And that's because, as we mentioned earlier, they're characterized by this carbon-fluorine bond, which is among the strongest bonds in chemistry. It's really hard to break these bonds down. So what that means is they can persist in the environment for centuries. And as I touched on, that really increases that window of exposure. So it's not just when we're spraying it on the crops and we eat it, the problem isn't done there. These pesticides and the PFAS component of them sort of persist for a really long time down the road. When they do break down, however, they often do so into these smaller degradation products. So that's not a full breakdown. It's essentially getting trimmed into a much smaller ultra short chain version, TFA being the major breakdown product of concern, which is again trifluoroacetic acid for those that are just tuning in. And the reason why that's so concerning is it's already been detected in soil, in groundwater, and in human bodies as well. There was a great study recently out of North Carolina that found that it accounted for a significant portion, over 90% of total environmental PFAS levels in groundwater, and that's just from this ultra short chain breakdown product known as TFA. Some PFAS pesticides have also been linked to other major environmental concerns, not just from their breakdown, but for example, many have been linked to reproductive issues and colony collapse disorders among bees, which is a huge concern. And as we study these chemicals more and more, we're finding more evidence of permanent, highly toxic environmental contamination and ones for which we frankly don't really have a solution at the moment.
Wow. Thank you for that, Varun. You're just full of good news, aren't you? No, but I love to get the skinny on this because we need to be eyes wide open. We need to understand the gravity of the situation so that we can all get involved and take action. So thank you so much, Varun. Susan, it pains me to ask this question because as a Californian, I like to think we're number one. But there are some states that have some regulations that are out ahead of us. And I'd love for you to talk to us about what's happening in Maine and Minnesota.
Absolutely. Great question. I'm happy to talk about our sister states who are doing such good work on PFAS. Minnesota has enacted a law that requires, essentially does a full phase out of PFAS uses in both products and pesticides. And that full phase out is supposed to go into effect in 2032. And they are in the process right now of implementing that bill, that law, and identifying kind of the processes for how they do that. Maine also passed a similar bill that requires phase out of both products and PFAS pesticides, and is also going undertaking that effort. So.
Excellent, excellent. And are there significant differences in the way that their states are set up? Like we have, you said, a government agency already in place, ready to do this. Did they, is it similar in those states where, I mean, it's basically about repurposing, a little bit of your staff time to work on this, but it already exists.
My understanding in terms of this full rolled out program, they are enacting it. They are embarking on a
Okay.
new program with existing agencies, but it is a fairly large effort because of the tremendous use of PFAS in all things.
Yeah.
So they are looking beyond pesticides and looking at everything from electronic device use and dental floss and everything that you can imagine that you don't want to imagine that PFAS has been used, is found
Yeah.
in. Yeah.
Yep. Sounds good. Thank you, Susan. Varun, back to you. You know, you're a scientist, but I want you to talk to all of us everyday people. While we wait for government regulation to go into place, what can we be doing as individuals to keep ourselves and our families safe from PFAS pesticide exposure?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And first things first, what we want to emphasize here is this is by no means designed to discourage fruit and vegetable consumption. We know from literature it's super important for folks to eat fruit and vegetable rich diets. The benefits of doing so will outweigh the risks of pesticide exposure. So, bottom line on top, don't stop eating fruits and vegetables because of these. But in the meantime, Americans are right to be concerned about what's on their produce. There is a lot of data at the moment to show that we aren't being sufficiently protected by our regulations. So until that regulation can catch up, there are some steps we can take, luckily. So PFAS pesticides, for example, are not permitted for use in organic farming. So shopping for organic fruits and vegetables where possible is an effective way to significantly reduce dietary PFAS pesticide exposure. Now, we know, organic produce isn't always accessible, feasible, even practical for a lot of Americans. I know I personally don't shop completely organic when I shop, so it is a really difficult thing to incorporate. Financial hurdles are very real and are very important to acknowledge. What we know is there are organic options that are often more affordable in the frozen aisle. PFAS pesticides are not permitted on those either. What we also know is that apart from shopping organic, there is another intervention that is shown to reduce pesticide exposure in general. So last year, EWG put out a report on our guide to washing produce. And so what we found was that really any washing is an effective way to reduce pesticides on produce. So a caveat for this is it wasn't a specific analysis on PFAS pesticides. That remains a gap in our understanding at the moment. But what we did find was that washing of any sort, so whether you're rinsing under tap water, soaking under tap water, soaking with vinegar, or baking soda, those have pretty much comparable efficacy in reducing your overall pesticide exposure. So that's a good intervention folks can take. Shop organic where possible, wash all of your produce. But really, with hundreds and thousands of pounds of these pesticides being applied across the country each year, the major solution to this issue is really going to be more science-grounded regulation to reduce that exposure and things that reflect the full range of health impacts.
hmm Varun, I'm sitting up straight and I'm so proud right now. You just validated me because I have three now adult kids who have been like, Mom, I don't think it does any good. You're just rinsing with water. And, I don't, I'm like, no, I'm telling you. Have you ever gotten sick from listeria in my household? No, you haven't. No, you have not. And you, and why? Because I wash our fruits and vegetables. But anyway, thank you for that, Varun. I think that's, while we wait for the government to catch up with, what we need to protect human health, that's a really good way to do it ourselves where we can. Susan, I know that a lot of people who live outside of the state of California think that we are a very health conscious state. So I have to ask, why has our state government been so slow to protect our health in this way?
Thank good. Well, as I said, this is the first time that the use of PFAS pesticides in the state has really been called out in California. And and it has not been on our state agency's radar. And because of that blind spot, even farmers, for instance, don't know that this is what they're applying on their land.
Hmm. Wow.
And so it's not just the consumer, at the grocery store
Mm-hmm.
that is now learning that this is what's on this produce. The farmers don't know that this is what they've been applying because the state has classified these pesticides in different ways, but not as PFAS. So
Interesting.
it's new information. Um, and it's essentially just a new lens being applied. And we really hope that with the passage of we're going to work really hard to get this ban through and to shed more light on the use of PFAS pesticides in our state. And certainly hope then that regulators will follow suit to try to help curb the effects of its ongoing use that have already happened. Um, but also work with all the local governments to make sure that um, as we transition towards a phase out, that the pesticides are really monitored and controlled.
Hmm. It seems crazy, and I've said this a million times over the 19 years that we've been on Go Green Radio, but like, why do we keep doing it this way? We allow products to come to market that are unhealthy, damaging to human health, and then we've got to put the genie back in the bottle when we realize, well, all of us realize, but somebody knew all along, that this wasn't a good mixture of chemicals or what have you, and then we have to ban it and go through the process of fighting about it. I would really love to see us move upstream in the approval process for some of these products. And on that, Varun, what are some of the gaps, scientific or otherwise, when it comes to regulating PFAS pesticides?
Sure, yeah. Joe, my background is in data science, so I'm quite free, honestly, a lot about the data here. And what was frustrating as we worked through this project was just how many massive gaps there are. And one
Mhm.
of those is that we don't really have studies at the moment that look specifically for biomarkers of PFAS pesticides in human samples. And what that will allow us to do is really understand the extent to which they can contaminate our bodies, understand the metabolic processes that are involved with sort of how these PFAS pesticides interplay in our body. So that's a major gap at the moment is we just don't have enough data on human impacts. A second one that was new to me as we were researching this was that at the moment, I know Susan touched on this previously, but when pesticides are regulated, very frequently there are waivers for the registrants on what they are required to show proof of. In other words, the studies that they report to the EPA at the time of getting these pesticides registered are not always the same. For PFAS pesticides, something that we frequently noticed was that the immunotoxicity data, so studies that show that the immune system is not being adversely harmed, those data sets are not required for submission. Very often, the EPA waives that requirement. We found that the vast majority of PFAS pesticides have been regulated without accounting for the immunotoxicity effects. Now, why does this matter? The European Food Safety Authority, Susan mentioned Maine and Minnesota. A lot of these other sort of peers to whom we can look are finding that immunotoxicity in particular is a major concern for PFAS pesticides. Essentially, our existing legal limits don't accurately reflect that whole suite of concerning health risks that come from PFAS pesticides. So that's another major data gap. Third one is that we need a lot more research on the effect of mixtures. So currently, regulation treats pesticides in a very siloed manner. It treats it as though we're exposed to them one at a time. In reality, we're exposed to cocktails of multiple different pesticides at once. And what we know is that many of these cocktails are more toxic than just the sum of their parts. When we're exposed to them as a group, it's more dangerous than when we're exposed to them individually. That's not reflected in our regulation at the moment, and it's a huge blind spot. Lastly, the thing that I'll mention is we see from other contexts, I mentioned the European Food Safety Authority, Maine, Minnesota, that even though we may not have a full comprehensive understanding of PFAS pesticides, what little we do know most certainly warrants more scrutiny and regulation of them at the moment. So we're falling behind at the moment, and that's something that we really need a lot more science and a lot more attention from our regulators on.
That was a mic drop moment, Varun. That was really, really helpful to understand. Thank you for that great explanation. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but when we come back, we have so much more with our awesome guests from the Environmental Working Group. So don't go away, folks. There's more Go Green Radio right after this. Welcome back to Go Green Radio. We're talking about a brand new California piece of legislation that just recently introduced, AB 1603. It would ban PFAS pesticides, and we're talking with two amazing representatives from the Environmental Working Group, or EWG. Big fan of that organization and all of the good work they do to protect our health, and protect our whole society from um, toxic chemicals and other exposures that uh, are definitely having an effect on our health. Varun, I want to go back to you. I mean, PFAS chemicals are called forever chemicals for a reason. Are we going to be able to put the proverbial toothpaste back in the tube by banning PFAS pesticides now? Or has the damage already been done?
Yeah, it's in EWG's opinion, it's crucial for us to enact this regulation, specifically those that are targeted at reducing our exposure to PFAS pesticides. And the reason for that is that we're already putting hundreds of thousands of pounds of these understudied chemicals into our environment, and increasingly we're finding into our bodies as well. So really, time is of the essence. We need to act swiftly. This is a problem that's just getting worse with time. Admittedly, we don't yet have a scalable or effective solution for cleaning up PFAS contamination in general. But I will say I review the literature every day, and there are hundreds of studies being published pretty much on a weekly basis that focus on new technologies that aim to remediate PFAS and get them out of the environment and increasingly out of our bodies too. So until that point, and until our science can catch up with the rate at which we are quite simply polluting, adequately health protective regulations are the only way to slow that rate of our growing environmental debt, so to speak. So, yeah, while we wait for sort of a cleanup solution that is effective at scale, our primary solution is just to stop adding to that burden that future generations are going to have to carry. So, I would say this regulation is super important. And yes, these are forever chemicals. That doesn't mean that we cannot work towards technologies that reduce the impact of these exposures, if not remove them altogether.
I've got one more. I'm just going to throw it out there. This goes to the folks that are manufacturing PFAS chemicals. Can you quit it? Until we actually have a solution to remediate these chemicals and deal with them once they've been let loose in the environment, you're all humans. You could make a human decision to quit it. So just a thought, throwing it out there. Susan, back to you. I imagine that we've got a lot of listeners out there, not just folks who are voters in California, but folks who care about this issue because it ends up on their plate from California produce. And they're probably thinking, what can I do? How can I get involved in helping to see this bill come over the finish line? Give us a call to action.
Absolutely. Well, for folks, in the United States, of course, and I'm speaking to all our international observers, the United States has a decentralized system of government. So we have local government, cities and counties, and state governments and federal government, and there's all these different entities involved in our data, regulating and deciding how we do things in our day-to-day lives. Well, when it comes to pesticides, that's that pesticides touch on a lot of different things. They touch on local governments have a role in how pesticides can be used. They have county agricultural commissioners that are approving at the local level, permitting the use of these pesticides. We have our um, state agencies, Department of Pesticide Regulation in California, and other sister agencies that are in, like the Water Board, that are involved in either the direct regulation of pesticides or the regulation of their effects, like the runoff into water, um, and the Department of Agriculture, which is involved with the, working with the growers on what they're doing. Everybody has kind of a little finger in this, as do the federal agencies. Of course, I mentioned the US EPA, and its sister aid and its um, various departments inside of that, as well as, of course, the larger federal network, members of Congress, the president, et cetera. But for Californians who want to help support AB 1603, I would really urge you all to contact your state assembly member and state senator and ask them to support the bill and to sign on as a co-author or prepare to support the legislation as it goes through the process. To the governor, I would ask folks to call the governor's office and ask him not only to support the legislation when it does eventually get to him, but also to ask his agencies to take decisive action right now on PFAS pesticides, because it's largely due to their kind of their blind spot that we're in this situation right now. Unfortunately, the Department of Pesticide Regulation has been, I would say, defensive about the concerns being raised here, and just recently even placed a blog on their website very dismissively addressing concerns. So I really encourage folks, even outside the state, to contact the governor's office and just express concern that that's the lack of state agency action in this regard is really affecting the nation as a whole.
Well, and for those who might remember what happened to a piece of California legislation just recently, where we were trying to ban PFAS in cookware, um, you want to tell them what happened to that, or do you want me to tell them?
Sure. So Environmental Working Group and others were co-sponsors of that bill. And it was actually, not only was the proposal to ban PFAS in cookware, but also to ban PFAS in a lot of other products. Um, we had, unfortunately, at the very end, it was the cookware industry that was the primary opponent of the bill. And the bill, while the legislature approved it and it got all the way through the process, and this would have been a bill to ban PFAS in 6 different product categories, large product categories. When it got to the governor's desk and the cookware industry was vehemently opposed, the governor did end up vetoing the bill. So that
Mhm.
was a huge disappointment, of course, for many people who put so much time and energy into trying to ensure that those protections would be in place.
Yeah, and here's the thing. I think that Governor Newsom, he's very famous throughout the country. I'm not saying he will, but if he does run for president, I mean, he's got to care what everybody thinks. So it's a perfect time for PFAS, activists throughout the country to let him know that you're watching. Because this is something that, our legislature has demonstrated some willingness to take action on, but if it gets vetoed on his desk again, there are a lot of human health protections that will go out with it. So, in terms of call to action, this is for everybody, not just Californians. Let Governor Newsom know where you stand on PFAS and that you do not want PFAS pesticides being used in the state of California or anywhere else. Let him know. I think it'll have an impact. Um, Susan, we've got just about a minute left in the show, which seems so unfair. I'd love to talk to you guys all day long. But in this final moment that we have left in the show, what final thoughts would you like to leave with our audience?
Well, first of all, just to remember that here in California, we found that 40%, almost 40% of fruits and vegetables grown here have PFAS pesticide residue on them when they are in front of when they arrive at the consumer level, when they are in the stores, when they're placed on our dinner table. And that is a serious, of course, that's should be a serious concern for folks, especially since there are so many health concerns around surrounding PFAS for human health, but also for environmental health. And that we should be doing all that we can to remove this use, to get rid of this use of PFAS. And this is a pivotal moment in time with this new information to take action and to move forward with the proposal like 1603 and efforts happening in other parts of the state, like in Minnesota and Maine, excuse me, in other parts of the nation, like in Minnesota and Maine, to address these chemicals and get them out of our commerce.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Varun. Thank you to the Environmental Working Group, of course, for all of your hard work, and thank you to each of you for joining us for another episode of Go Green Radio. We'll be here same time, same place next week with more good stuff, so don't go anywhere. Come right back and see us and do something to go green in your life this week. And it might just be writing a letter to Governor Newsom. See you next week.
Thank you.